By 835, England had learned something that would have sounded impossible a generation earlier. The raiders from the north could be studied. In the beginning, Viking attacks had felt like storms, sudden, violent, and gone before anyone could make sense of what happened. Coastal communities had watched black sails appear where the sea had been empty, and within hours the world they knew was ash, bodies, and silence. But storms leave traces. After enough years, people start to notice where the wind usually comes from. People begin comparing stories. Leaders begin collecting reports. Slowly, fear stops being raw panic and becomes something sharper. Expectation. Patterns were not comforting, but they were useful. The Vikings preferred the coast because ships were their advantage. They favored certain bays and river mouths where long ships could land fast and leave fast. Rivers mattered more than roads. A long ship could glide inland far quicker than an army could march to meet it. Raids clustered in predictable seasons, after winter loosened its grip when the sea was safer and supplies could be carried. And the targets, for a time, were obvious. Places with wealth, places with little protection, places that had never needed to think like fortresses. In English minds, the Viking threat began to take a shape that could be planned for, so defenses improved. Watchposts were strengthened along coasts that had been struck before. Horns and beacons were organized into warning chains. Riders were assigned to carry word inland. Militias were drilled to gather at known points instead of scattering in panic. In a few key places, fortifications were built or repaired. Earthworks, palisades, strengthened gates, anything that could slow a sudden assault long enough for men to arrive. The mindset was simple. If the Vikings returned to the same places, then England would no longer be caught blind. That last assumption was the mistake. The English confused knowledge with power. They mistook understanding for victory. They began to act as if the Vikings were a problem that could be solved with preparation alone, and in doing so they revealed something to their enemy, where England believed danger would strike. What England did not understand was that predictability cuts both ways. A pattern that comforts the defender can also guide the attacker. Once the English began to treat the Vikings as a force that could be anticipated, they started building defenses in places that announced what they feared most. They created habits the Vikings could watch. They gathered men where they expected trouble. They tightened their grip on the coast while leaving other places thinner. In trying to make the raids predictable, England made itself predictable. In the years leading up to that misread, the English poured labor into visible solutions. Earth was cut into ramparts. Timber palisades rose along approaches that had once been open. Local lords demanded workdays from households, and villages exhausted themselves building walls, ditches, gates, watchtowers. The work produced something people could see, and that visibility created a false certainty. A wall makes a settlement feel protected even when the enemy can simply choose another shore. So, when the fleet in 835 slipped past the strong points, it did not feel like chance. It felt like an answer. The Vikings were proving that defenses designed to stand still would always be slower than attackers willing to change direction. The Vikings were learning too. They were not a single army following a single plan. They were leaders, crews, and bands who shared habits and traded information. They watched the English coastline the way hunters watch a ridgeline. They noticed where men gathered and where they did not. They learned which towns now had guards and which still relied on prayer and distance. They listened for the speed of alarms, how long it took for smoke to rise, for riders to appear, for militia to assemble. And once the Vikings understood the pattern of English preparation, they didn't challenge the strongest part of it. They went around it. In 835, a large Viking fleet arrived at the English coast. It was big enough to trigger everything England had built to resist it. Lookouts spotted the sails. Horns sounded. Beacons flared. Messages rode inland. Warriors assembled at the fortified points along the shore, gripping spears and shields, feeling for the first time that they might meet the attack on their terms. The coastline looked ready. The defenders were waiting. England believed this was the moment preparation would be rewarded. Then the Vikings did something England had not planned for. The fleet did not strike where the defenses stood thickest. It shifted. It moved along the coast, slipped past the strong points, and landed where the warning chain was thin, where militias were slow, where fortifications were absent because the place was deemed too small, too poor, too insignificant to matter. They struck supply villages, farm communities, and the quiet points that fed the larger towns. They burned storehouses, they emptied barns, they killed resistance quickly. They took what could be carried and destroyed what could not. And before organized forces could reach them, they moved again. The shock was not just the destruction. England had endured destruction before. The shock was the intelligence behind it. The Vikings had looked at England's defenses and stepped around them. England had built walls against yesterday's danger, and the Vikings had used those walls as a map of where England expected pain. The raids were becoming predictable, yes, but predictable in the wrong way. England could often guess where ships might appear. It could not guess where violence would land. That year marked the beginning of an intensification that lasted through the 840s. English defenses continued to improve because they had to. More watchposts, better riders, stronger forts, more disciplined gathering points. In some regions, local leaders attempted to coordinate with neighbors instead of acting alone. But every improvement created a new habit, and every habit could be studied. The Vikings responded with sharper tactics, and that sharpening is what made the violence feel unpredictable. Sometimes the Vikings attacked quickly and left. Sometimes they stayed long enough to strip a region bare. Sometimes they hit a place that made sense. Wealthy, exposed, symbolic. Other times they hit what looked meaningless, and that was the point. A raid that destroys a monastery steals gold. A raid that destroys a supply village breaks the ability to resist. A raid that targets a noble estate humiliates a lord. A raid that targets scattered farms starves a district. The Vikings learned that fear could be engineered not only by surprise, but by pressure. The hardest part for the English was that there was no single new Viking tactic to counter, no one trick that could be named and solved. The Vikings varied their approach deliberately. Sometimes a landing was made openly as if inviting a battle, only for the main force to move elsewhere after the defenders had committed. Sometimes small groups struck scattered targets in a single district, forcing the English to spread out and weakening every response. Sometimes the Vikings used speed alone, hitting one location, then another, before any defense could settle. Their aim was not merely to take wealth, it was to keep England guessing, exhausted, and constantly reacting. That is why the violence felt like it had no pattern even when the raids did. The English saw the ships, they could count the sails, they could guess the season, but they could not predict where the next wound would be cut, and a kingdom that cannot predict its wounds begins to doubt its own strength. English morale began to fracture. Communities that had rebuilt after earlier attacks discovered that rebuilding was not enough if the next raid came from an unexpected direction. A town might spend months strengthening its palisade only to watch neighboring villages burn, flooding the town with refugees and draining its food. An army might gather to defend a river crossing only to learn that longships had landed elsewhere and were moving along back routes. A region might believe itself safe because it had never been struck, until it was struck precisely because it had never been defended. By the late 830s, English leaders were forced into grim discussions. The question was no longer simply, how do we stop raids? It was, how do we keep the kingdom from breaking under continuous pressure? Some argued for decisive battle, gather a large force, hunt the Vikings, destroy them. Others argued for negotiation, paying for time, buying breathing room, making treaties that could reduce the bleeding. Another faction argued for consolidation, abandon what could not be defended, and protect what could. Each option carried a cost. Each option carried shame. None offered certainty. A new English king was chosen during this period, young enough that some hoped he could become a symbol of renewal, and inexperienced enough that others doubted he could carry the weight of the crisis. He inherited a realm where confidence had evaporated, and where borders mattered less than supply lines. He could command loyalty, but loyalty did not create food, and it did not create time. He could call men to arms, but men called to arms could not harvest fields, and fields left unharvested became famine. This king, like many leaders forced to govern in disaster, had to make choices that would anger someone no matter what. If he pursued battle, he risked losing the army that protected the heartland. If he pursued negotiation, he risked being seen as weak. If he consolidated, he risked abandoning people who still called themselves his subjects. Yet the deeper truth was simple. England could not fight everywhere at once. The Vikings did not need to win one decisive fight if they could make the kingdom bleed in 10 places at once. The Vikings, meanwhile, were shifting their ambitions. Raiding had always been profitable, but profit has limits. In the early years, fleets came, took, and left because leaving kept them safe. But as English defenses grew more organized, leaving also meant surrendering the advantage of presence. The Vikings began to stay. Winter camps appeared. Temporary bases became something sturdier. A crew that could hold land for a season could hold it for a year. A band that could survive a winter on English soil could begin to call that soil theirs. This change altered everything. When Vikings stayed, raids became less about a sudden strike and more about shaping the landscape around them. They could threaten a region even when their ships were not moving. Their power could be felt in demands, food, shelter, forced cooperation. A community that had once feared the appearance of ships now feared the arrival of men who were already nearby. Violence became less spectacular, but more constant. It was used to enforce, to punish, to set examples. A village that complied might survive with its stores diminished. A village that resisted might be burned until resistance became impossible. England's maps still presented the kingdom as unified, because maps are statements of desire as much as they are descriptions of reality. They showed borders, names of regions, and the authority of the crown. But the land was no longer obedient to ink. In practice, large stretches of territory answered to Viking leaders who held real power. Power backed by warriors, by alliances, and by the simple fact of being present. English officials could still claim rule, but claims did not feed garrisons or move armies. The kingdom looked whole on parchment. The kingdom was divided on the ground. As the 840s progressed, trade began to creep back into the cracks of conflict. This was not because hatred had vanished, but because survival requires exchange. Vikings wanted iron, grain, cloth, livestock, tools, things England could provide. English communities wanted predictability and relief from constant burning, and trade could buy a measure of that. Markets reopened in some places under uneasy rules. Goods moved between English and Viking hands. A man who could not defeat his neighbor might still bargain with him because bargaining kept his children fed. The church adapted as well. In the earliest raids, monasteries had been ideal targets, wealthy and vulnerable. But as Vikings settled, the church became something else, a network of literacy, negotiation, and influence. Priests and abbots could communicate across regions. They could record agreements. They could mediate disputes. Some Viking leaders accepted baptism, sometimes out of belief, often out of practicality. A baptized leader could gain legitimacy among Christians and ease trade. Even when conversion was shallow, it served as a bridge. It did not erase conflict, but it created shared language. None of this meant the fighting ended. Skirmishes flared, rebellions rose and were crushed. Acts of revenge echoed across seasons. Yet full-scale war became harder to sustain because both sides were entangled. An English lord might need Viking cooperation to keep roads safe. A Viking leader might need English farmers to harvest fields. Local arrangements formed, some formal, some improvised, many fragile. They were not the sort of unity sung about. They were the sort of unity that happens when the alternative is endless ruin. English military culture changed under this pressure. Earlier in the century, a sudden raid could scatter defenders. Now, in some regions, English forces learned discipline. They trained to hold formation. They learned to stand behind shields rather than chase in disorganized pursuit. When this worked, it worked brutally. A well-held shield wall could turn a confident Viking charge into disaster. It could punish impatience. It could make numbers matter less than steadiness. English leaders began to believe that at last they could meet the Vikings properly, and the Vikings adapted right back. If a fortified town held, they could bypass it. If a shield wall refused to break, they could refuse to engage it. They could strike where the wall was not, where the defenders had moved away, where supplies traveled. They could force English leaders to choose between protecting one place and protecting another. They could wait until hunger and exhaustion did the work of swords. They could make defense feel like an endless series of wrong decisions. By the middle of the decade, England's problem was no longer only raids, it was occupation, influence, and the slow shift of identity. Viking settlements meant new laws in certain regions, new leaders, new customs, new ways of dividing land. English communities under Viking rule learned what compliance looked like and what resistance cost. Some resisted anyway. Some complied and survived. Many simply tried to endure the next season without losing everything. Silence spread faster than ships because fear no longer depended on the horizon. People did not need to see long ships to know the Vikings were near. Stories traveled of villages punished, of agreements broken, of towns spared because they paid, of communities ruined because they refused. The most dangerous part was not always the raid itself, it was the uncertainty of what would happen afterward. Would the Vikings leave? Would they return? Would they settle? Would the next demand be harsher? The raids could be predicted, the consequences could not. By the middle of the 840s, the division was clear enough that even loyal scribes struggled to describe England as one thing. On parchment, the kingdom still looked whole because kings do not commission maps to display failure. In practice, authority reached only as far as men could be sent and fed. Some districts paid English officials, others paid Viking leaders. Some areas changed hands or split their loyalties, depending on who was nearest and strongest. And yet fracture sometimes forced cooperation. In border regions, English and Viking leaders aligned to deal with threats neither could ignore: bandits, rival warbands, feuds that disrupted trade. Mutual interest did what pride could not. Slowly, grudgingly, a kind of union formed where constant fighting had become unbearable. Agreements to keep roads open, to protect markets, to punish raiders who threatened both sides. And in the midst of that reshaping, a quieter transformation took place. Where Vikings stayed long enough, and where English communities endured long enough, coexistence became unavoidable. War is simple when enemies are distant. It becomes complicated when they share roads, fields, markets, and winter nights. Over time, some regions began to act as if the future depended on cooperation more than conquest. These were not grand treaties announced in great halls. They were arrangements made in the places where survival mattered, in fields, at river crossings, in market squares, at the edges of towns where two groups watched each other closely and decided to trade instead of burn. After harsh winters, something changed in the mind as much as in the land. Distance stopped protecting people. Far away ceased to mean safe. When the next threat can be in the next valley, the world feels smaller and survival becomes a matter of relationships, not borders. It is in that shrinking world that unity, real, practical unity, began to appear. Not as a celebration, but as a recognition that neither side could erase the other quickly, and that living meant building a structure strong enough to hold the weight of two worlds. By 845, England was no longer the same kingdom that had tried to solve raids with coastal forts and warning horns. The crown still existed, and so did the idea of a united realm, but the reality was divided. Viking power held large regions, English power held others, and between them lay a landscape of shifting agreements. The English had become warriors because they had to. The Vikings had become conquerors because they chose to. England had prepared in its own eyes for the fight it expected. The Vikings had sharpened their tactics and struck where preparation was weakest, again and again, until England's certainty turned into doubt. In that decade, the raids did become predictable in one sense. Everyone understood they were part of life. People knew what a longship meant. They knew how quickly a district could collapse. They knew which routes the sea and rivers offered. But the violence did not become predictable, because the Vikings refused to let it. They changed where they struck, how long they stayed, and what they demanded. They turned English preparation into a tool they could exploit. They forced England to react until reaction itself became a kind of defeat. The raids became predictable, the violence didn't. And England, caught between fortification and adaptation, between battle and bargaining, was transformed into something it had not been before. Half defended, half taken, and slowly learning that survival sometimes looks like unity, forged under pressure.